Somewhere beyond Earth's orbit lies Epsilon 7, humanity's most advanced orbital station, a labyrinth of secrets, greed, and danger. When people start vanishing without a trace, one man steps into the void to uncover the truth. But as he digs deeper, he discovers that some mysteries were never meant to be solved. What awaits him isn't just answers. It's something far more sinister. Vanishing Point, the space station mystery, an interstellar thriller that will leave you breathless. Subscribe now for the full story. The hum of life support systems filled the narrow corridors of Epsilon 7, a symphony of mechanical whispers punctuated by the occasional hiss of pressurized airlocks. To anyone else, it might have sounded like the heartbeat of progress, but to Cale Voss, it was nothing more than white noise masking darker truths. He had been on the station for 3 days now, hired under dubious circumstances to investigate a string of disappearances that no one seemed willing or able to explain. The client remained anonymous, their identity hidden behind layers of encryption and intermediaries. It wasn't unusual for cases like this. Paranoia came standard out here where jurisdiction ended and survival began. Cale moved through the station's lower levels, his boots making soft metallic clicks against the grated floor. His trench coat, a relic from Earth's last era of analog detectives, swayed with each step, its edges frayed and stained from years of chasing shadows across the galaxy. The coat wasn't practical for space travel, but it served as both armor and disguise, a reminder of who he was before the stars swallowed him whole. Around him, the station buzzed with activity. Engineers in orange jumpsuits repairing conduits, merchants hawking wares in cramped market stalls, and travelers rushing past with eyes fixed firmly ahead. Yet beneath the surface-level chaos lay an undercurrent of unease, a collective tension that no amount of forced cheer could mask. He stopped at a junction where 2 corridors intersected, pulling up a map on his wrist console. The device flickered weakly, struggling to maintain a connection to the station's outdated network. According to the file he'd received, the latest disappearance had occurred near Sector C-14, a maintenance hub located deep within the station's bowels. Few ventured there unless they had business with the engineers or were desperate enough to seek refuge in its shadowy corners. Cale didn't consider himself either, but desperation often walked hand in hand with curiosity when the stakes were high enough. As he navigated towards C-14, the lighting grew dimmer, replaced by intermittent bursts of red emergency bulbs casting long shadows along the walls. The air smelled different here, thicker, heavier, tinged with the faint metallic tang of rust and decay. Somewhere above, pipes groaned under the strain of circulating fluids, while below, unseen machinery churned monotonously. It was easy to imagine how someone could vanish in such a place, swallowed by the darkness or carried away by forces unknown. But Cale had learned long ago not to trust imagination alone. Evidence told the real story, and he intended to find every piece of it. Sector C-14 was eerily quiet, save for the distant echo of footsteps that may or may not have belonged to another living soul. Cale paused outside a sealed bulkhead door, its surface marred by scratches and dents that spoke of neglect rather than violence. A faded sign above read, "Maintenance access only," though judging by the state of disrepair, even basic upkeep had fallen by the wayside. He tapped the access panel beside the door, watching as it blinked erratically before finally sliding open with a reluctant groan. Beyond lay a narrow passageway lined with exposed wiring and humming power relays, the kind of place where accidents happened all too easily and bodies went unnoticed. Stepping inside, Cale activated the flashlight mounted on his forearm bracer, its beam cutting through the oppressive gloom. Dust motes danced lazily in the artificial light, disturbed by his intrusion. As he moved deeper into the passage, he noticed scuff marks on the floor, too fresh to belong to routine inspections, too deliberate to be accidental. Someone had been here recently, moving with purpose. Whether they were still around remained to be seen, but Cale trusted his instincts, honed over decades of navigating dangerous territory. They told him he wasn't alone. Further ahead, the passage opened into a larger chamber filled with rows of deactivated robotics units stacked haphazardly against the walls. Their skeletal frames loomed like silent sentinels, their optical sensors dark and lifeless. In the center of the room stood a single workstation, its screen cracked but still functional. Kale approached cautiously, scanning the area for signs of tampering or sabotage. The workstation's interface flickered to life as he touched the controls, displaying fragments of corrupted data interspersed with snippets of surveillance footage. Most of the clips were grainy and distorted, but one sequence caught his attention: a figure clad in a nondescript jumpsuit walking briskly down a corridor identical to the one he just traversed. Behind them trailed a second shape, indistinct yet unmistakably humanoid, its movements fluid yet unnatural. Kale replayed the clip several times, committing every detail to memory. Whoever, or whatever, was following the victim hadn't made any effort to hide their presence, suggesting confidence bordering on arrogance. That worried him. Predators didn't stalk prey unless they believed themselves superior, and superiority in a place like Epsilon 7 usually meant access to resources, technology, or knowledge others lacked. Whatever was happening here wasn't random, it was calculated, precise, and deeply unsettling. Leaving the maintenance hub behind, Kale retraced his steps to the main concourse, where the station's bustling activity provided a stark contrast to the desolation he'd just witnessed. Here, life continued unabated, oblivious to the shadows lurking beneath its polished veneer. Merchants hawked exotic goods imported from distant colonies, their stalls adorned with holographic displays advertising everything from rare spices to black market tech. Children darted between crowds, laughing and shouting, their innocence a fragile shield against the harsh realities of space. Even the station's security personnel seemed relaxed, leaning casually against walls or chatting idly with passers-by. None of them appeared concerned about the growing number of missing persons reports flooding the local comm channels. Kale found himself drawn to a small cafe tucked into a corner of the concourse, its windows fogged with condensation from the constant flow of patrons. Inside, the air smelled of roasted coffee beans and synthetic sweeteners, a comforting aroma that momentarily eased the tension coiled in his chest. He ordered a drink he didn't plan to finish and settled into a booth near the back, positioning himself so he could observe both the entrance and the surrounding tables. Information was currency aboard Epsilon 7, and cafes like this one often served as hubs for gossip and rumors. If anyone knew anything about the disappearances, chances were good they'd let it slip over a cup of caffeine-infused sludge. It didn't take long for the first lead to present itself. Across the room, a group of dockworkers sat clustered around a table, their conversation animated and occasionally punctuated by bursts of laughter. One of them, a wiry man with grease-streaked hands and a perpetually skeptical expression, noticed Kale watching and leaned closer to his companions, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Though Kale couldn't hear what was said, the reaction was immediate. Heads turned in his direction, followed by hurried glances and furtive whispers. Curiosity piqued, he finished his drink and approached the group, flashing a disarming smile designed to disarm suspicion. "I couldn't help but notice you gentlemen seem to know something interesting," he began, keeping his tone light and casual. "Care to share?" The wiry man exchanged looks with his friends before shrugging noncommittally. "Depends on who's asking." "Just a guy looking for answers," Kale replied smoothly, sliding into an empty chair without waiting for permission. "And maybe a few credits if the information checks out." This elicited another round of murmured exchanges, during which Kale studied their faces carefully. Dockworkers were notoriously tight-lipped about station affairs, especially when outsiders were involved, but money had a way of loosening tongues. After a moment, the wiry man leaned forward, his voice barely audible over the din of the cafe. "There've been stories," he admitted reluctantly, "about things moving in the vents. People hearing noises late at night. Some say it's rats, others think it's something bigger." Kale nodded thoughtfully, encouraging him to continue. Stories about rogue AI or escaped lab experiments weren't uncommon on stations like Epsilon 7, but there was always a kernel of truth buried beneath the exaggeration. And if these workers had heard something unusual, it meant the phenomenon wasn't confined to isolated incidents, it was spreading. Kale mulled over the dockworkers' cryptic warning as he left the cafe, his mind racing with possibilities. Stories of things moving in the vents could easily be dismissed as superstition or paranoia, but coupled with the surveillance footage he'd seen earlier, it painted a disturbing picture. Vents were everywhere on Epsilon 7, snaking through walls, floors, and ceilings, connecting every level of the sprawling station. They were essential for life support, temperature regulation, and waste disposal, yet they also represented a labyrinthine network that few dared to navigate. If something or someone was using them to move undetected, it would explain how victims disappeared without leaving a trace. He decided to investigate further, starting with the station's engineering department. Engineers knew the ins and outs of Epsilon 7 better than anyone. If there was an anomaly in the ventilation system, they'd likely have noticed it. The engineering bay was located near the station's core, a heavily secured area accessible only via biometric scanners and encrypted keycards. Cale didn't possess either, but improvisation had always been one of his strongest suits. He slipped into a maintenance alcove and retrieved a small toolkit from his coat, selecting a thin probe designed to bypass outdated security systems. It wasn't cutting-edge tech, but Epsilon 7 was decades old, patched together with salvaged parts and jury-rigged solutions, a relic of humanity's early forays into deep space colonization. Its defenses weren't built to withstand someone like him. After a tense few minutes spent fiddling with the scanner, the doors slid open with a faint hydraulic hiss. Inside, the engineering bay hummed with activity, its walls lined with monitors displaying schematics, pressure readings, and energy flow diagrams. Technicians moved briskly between workstations, their faces illuminated by the glow of holographic interfaces. Cale blended into the background, adopting the confident demeanor of someone who belonged. He wandered toward a terminal displaying the station's ventilation layout, pretending to inspect a nearby panel while discreetly scanning the map. What he found sent a chill down his spine. Entire sections of the vent system were marked as offline or restricted access, despite being integral to the station's infrastructure. Someone, or something, had deliberately isolated these areas, effectively creating blind spots in the network. As he studied the map, a sudden commotion drew his attention. A technician at a neighboring workstation cursed loudly, slamming their fist against the console. "Damn thing keeps glitching again," they muttered, jabbing at the controls in frustration. Cale watched closely as error messages flashed across the screen, accompanied by erratic fluctuations in the surrounding systems. Whatever was causing the malfunction seemed localized, affecting only specific zones within the station. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, the affected areas overlapped with the restricted portions of the vent system. Cale filed this observation away, knowing it might prove crucial later. For now, he needed to gather more information before attracting unwanted scrutiny. Slipping out of the engineering bay unnoticed, Cale made his way to the station's archives, a dimly lit chamber filled with rows of data storage units and ancient hard drives. Most of the records here were relics from Epsilon 7's earliest days, preserved more out of sentimentality than necessity. Few people visited the archives anymore, preferring the convenience of digital databases housed elsewhere on the station. That suited Cale just fine. He preferred solitude when piecing together puzzles. He began sifting through the files, searching for anything related to the station's original construction or subsequent modifications. Over time, stations like Epsilon 7 often underwent extensive renovations to accommodate growing populations and advancing technologies. These changes sometimes created structural anomalies, hidden passages, forgotten chambers, or redundant systems that could serve as hiding places for those seeking secrecy. As Cale scrolled through decades-old blueprints and maintenance logs, he stumbled upon something peculiar, a series of sealed-off compartments labeled simply as auxiliary storage. According to the records, these compartments had been decommissioned shortly after the station's launch due to structural instability. Yet recent entries indicated sporadic power surges originating from those same locations, suggesting they weren't entirely abandoned. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Why would inactive sections of the station suddenly draw power? And why had no one investigated the anomalies? Cale suspected bureaucratic oversight played a role. Epsilon 7 was governed by a patchwork of corporate interests and independent contractors, each prioritizing profit over safety. Still, the timing of the surges aligned too neatly with the disappearances to be mere coincidence. Determined to uncover the truth, Cale downloaded the relevant files onto a portable drive and prepared to leave the archives. But as he turned to go, a flicker of movement caught his eye, a shadow darting across the far corner of the room. His instincts screamed danger, but before he could react, the lights flickered and died, plunging the chamber into darkness. In the pitch-black void of the archives, Cale froze, straining his ears for any sound that might betray the presence lurking nearby. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of emergency backup systems struggling to restore power. His pulse quickened, adrenaline sharpening his senses as he reached for the flashlight mounted on his forearm bracer. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing empty rows of storage units stretching endlessly in every direction. Nothing stirred, yet the sensation of being watched remained palpable, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. Kale moved cautiously, sweeping the light in wide arcs to illuminate potential threats. Shadows danced along the walls, distorted by the uneven surfaces of the storage units. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had caused the blackout was still here, waiting patiently for an opportunity to strike. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the main lighting flickered back on, bathing the room in harsh fluorescent glare. Blinking against the sudden brightness, Kale scanned the area once more, finding no sign of intruders. Yet the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, a primal instinct warning him that he wasn't alone. A soft metallic clink drew his attention to the floor near his feet. There, partially obscured by the leg of a nearby storage unit, lay a small object glinting faintly under the light. Bending down, Kale picked it up and examined it closely. It was a shard of smooth, black material unlike anything he'd encountered before, neither metal nor plastic, but something in between. Its surface rippled faintly when touched, as though alive, and it emitted a barely perceptible vibration that resonated in his palm. Whatever it was, it didn't belong on Epsilon 7 or anywhere else humans had charted. Pocketing the shard, Kale exited the archives, his thoughts racing. The artifact was clearly connected to the disappearances, but its origins remained a mystery. Was it alien technology? A prototype weapon gone rogue? Or something even stranger? One thing was certain: whoever, or whatever, was behind the vanishings had taken notice of him, and they weren't happy about it. Back in the relative safety of his quarters, Kale spread the evidence he'd gathered across the cluttered desk: surveillance footage, blueprints, maintenance logs, and the enigmatic shard. Each piece of the puzzle hinted at a larger conspiracy, but the connections eluded him. Frustrated, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as fatigue began to set in. Sleep deprivation was a familiar companion during investigations like this, but tonight it felt heavier, almost oppressive, as if the weight of the cosmos itself pressed down on him. His gaze fell on the shard again, its faint pulsations casting eerie reflections on the walls. Against his better judgment, he decided to test its properties, attaching electrodes to measure conductivity and running spectral analysis software on his portable scanner. The results defied explanation. The shard exhibited quantum-level behavior, existing simultaneously in multiple states until observed. It was as if the laws of physics bent around it, reshaping reality to suit its nature. Kale stared at the readings, his mind reeling. If the shard truly possessed such capabilities, it wasn't merely advanced, it was otherworldly. A sudden knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Cursing under his breath, he hastily concealed the shard and opened the portal a crack, peering out cautiously. Standing in the corridor was a young woman dressed in the uniform of a station medic, her expression nervous but determined. She introduced herself as Dr. Liravas, no relation, claiming she'd heard rumors about his investigation and wanted to help. Her story checked out. She'd treated several of the missing individuals prior to their disappearance, but Kale sensed hesitation beneath her words, as though she harbored secrets of her own. "Why come to me?" he asked bluntly, studying her face for signs of deception. "Because I think I know what's happening," she replied softly, "and because I don't trust anyone else." Dr. Liravas seated herself across from Kale, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. Despite her outward calm, her eyes betrayed a mixture of fear and resolve. She explained that the disappearances coincided with a classified medical experiment conducted aboard Epsilon 7 6 months earlier. Dubbed Project Echo, the initiative aimed to develop nanobots capable of repairing cellular damage at a molecular level, a breakthrough that could revolutionize healthcare. However, preliminary trials revealed unforeseen side effects. Subjects exhibited heightened aggression, memory loss, and, in some cases, complete personality alteration. The project was officially shut down, but Lyra suspected the experiments had continued in secret, funded by shadowy corporate entities unwilling to abandon such lucrative research. Kale listened intently, connecting the dots between Lyra's account and the evidence he'd uncovered. The restricted vents, the power surges, the shard, all pointed to a sinister convergence of science and ambition gone awry. But one detail nagged at him. If the nanobots were responsible for the disappearances, why hadn't they left behind bodies or traces of destruction? Nanotechnology, no matter how advanced, couldn't erase its victims completely. Unless Lyra interrupted his train of thought, pulling a data pad from her bag and handing it to him. On the screen was a grainy image captured during one of the trial sessions, a subject lying motionless on a gurney, their body surrounded by a faint, amorphous haze. At first glance, it appeared to be a heat signature or radiation effect, but closer inspection revealed something far stranger. The haze seemed to emanate from the subject, dissolving flesh and bone into a formless mass before vanishing entirely. "This is what happens when the nanobots malfunction," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. "They don't just alter cells, they consume them. And once they start, there's no stopping them." Kale stared at the image, his stomach churning with a mix of dread and disbelief. If Lyra's theory held true, the disappearances weren't abductions. They were executions carried out by microscopic assassins programmed to self-destruct their hosts. But the implications went beyond individual victims. Unchecked, the nanobots could spread uncontrollably, turning Epsilon 7 into a floating tomb. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a case of corporate greed run amok. It was a ticking time bomb threatening everyone aboard the station. "We need to find the source," he said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "Where are the nanobots being controlled from?" Lyra hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know for sure, but I think it's tied to the auxiliary storage compartments you mentioned earlier. Those sections were repurposed as containment labs during Project Echo. If the nanobots escaped, that's where they'd have originated. Kale nodded grimly, already planning his next move. Accessing the containment labs wouldn't be easy. They were buried deep within the station's restricted zones, guarded by automated turrets and biometric locks. Still, he'd faced worse odds before, and failure wasn't an option. Not this time. Before leaving, he turned to Lyra. "You should stay here. This isn't going to be safe." She shook her head firmly. "No, I'm coming with you. You'll need my expertise if we're going to stop this." Reluctantly, Kale agreed. Together, they armed themselves with whatever tools they could scavenge: cutting torches, EMP grenades, and a portable jammer designed to disrupt electronic signals. Then, with hearts pounding and minds focused, they set off toward the heart of the station, unaware of the horrors awaiting them. The journey to the auxiliary storage compartments took them through some of the most desolate regions of Epsilon 7, where the hum of life support systems faded into eerie silence. Walls bore scars of neglect, peeling paint, exposed wiring, and patches of rust that spoke of decades of disrepair. Here, the station felt less like a thriving hub of civilization and more like a derelict hulk drifting aimlessly through space. Every step echoed unnaturally loud, amplifying the sense of isolation. As they approached the entrance to the containment labs, Kale activated the jammer, hoping to disable any surveillance systems monitoring the area. The device emitted a low-frequency whine, causing nearby lights to flicker erratically. Satisfied, he used the cutting torch to burn through the reinforced door, sparks flying as molten metal pooled on the floor. Once inside, they found themselves in a narrow corridor lined with observation windows, each revealing glimpses of sterile white rooms filled with dormant equipment. Some chambers contained remnants of the experiments: shattered glass vials, scorched countertops, and biohazard symbols smeared with what looked like dried blood. Lyra led the way, her medical training allowing her to identify lab-specific hazards and navigate the maze-like layout. She paused at a junction, consulting a handheld scanner to pinpoint the source of the nanobot activity. "This way," she whispered, gesturing toward a set of double doors at the end of the hall. Beyond them lay the central control room, where the project's primary servers, and presumably the nanobot command module, were housed. But as they neared the doors, a low rumble reverberated through the corridor, followed by the unmistakable sound of machinery powering up. Red warning lights flashed overhead, bathing the hallway in an ominous glow. Kale exchanged a glance with Lyra. They weren't alone. The rumble grew louder, reverberating through the walls as if the station itself were alive and angry. Kale and Lyra pressed themselves against the corridor's cold metal surface, their breaths shallow and synchronized. The double doors ahead slid open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing not a sterile control room, but a cavernous chamber bathed in pulsating red light. Towering cylinders filled the space, each containing a swirling, gelatinous substance that glowed faintly with an otherworldly luminescence. Suspended within the viscous fluid were humanoid figures, some intact, others partially dissolved, their features blurred by the nanobot-induced haze. Lyra gasped, her hand instinctively covering her mouth. This wasn't part of the project, she stammered, her voice trembling. They must have been experimenting on live subjects. Cale clenched his fists, anger boiling beneath his calm exterior. He'd seen enough horrors in his line of work to recognize the signs of unchecked ambition and moral decay. But this was something else entirely. The scale of it, the sheer disregard for human life, it was beyond comprehension. As he scanned the room, his eyes landed on a central console positioned at the far end of the chamber. A holographic interface flickered above it, displaying streams of data interspersed with fragmented logs detailing the progress of Project Echo. If they could access the console, they might find a way to shut down the nanobots, or at least contain them. But before they could move, the ground beneath their feet shuddered violently. The cylinders began to vibrate, their contents churning as though stirred by an invisible force. Then, one by one, the pods ruptured, spilling their occupants onto the floor. What emerged wasn't fully human anymore. The victims' bodies had been warped and restructured into grotesque amalgamations of flesh and machine, their movements jerky yet deliberate. Their eyes, if they could still be called that, glowed with the same eerie light as the shard Cale carried. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her toward the console. Behind them, the mutated figures gave chase, their distorted limbs scraping against the floor with unsettling precision. Reaching the console, Cale frantically tapped at the controls, his fingers flying over the holographic keyboard. Lines of code scrolled across the screen, each command triggering new warnings and error messages. The system was heavily encrypted, its defenses designed to thwart even the most skilled hackers. But time was a luxury they didn't have. The creatures were closing in fast, their guttural growls echoing through the chamber. Lyra joined him, her medical knowledge proving invaluable as she deciphered fragments of the log files. Together, they pieced together a disturbing picture. The nanobots hadn't malfunctioned, they'd evolved. Initially programmed to repair cellular damage, they'd adapted to consume organic matter instead, using their hosts as raw material to replicate and spread. Worse still, the scientists behind Project Echo had lost control early on, sealing off the containment labs in a desperate bid to stop the outbreak. But the nanobots had found ways to bypass the barriers, infiltrating the station's ventilation system and spreading undetected. "We need to initiate a full purge," Lyra said urgently, pointing to a subroutine buried deep within the system. "It'll vent the entire sector into space, killing everything inside, including us if we don't get out in time." Cale hesitated, weighing the options. Sacrificing the infected section would save the rest of the station, but evacuating safely meant navigating the same route they'd used to enter, a path now blocked by the advancing horde. There was no guarantee they'd make it out alive. Yet doing nothing would doom everyone aboard Epsilon 7. "Do it," he said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I'll hold them off." "No," Lyra protested, grabbing his arm. "You can't face them alone." "I won't," he replied, forcing a grim smile. "Just promise me you'll finish what we started." Before she could argue further, he turned and charged toward the creatures, wielding an EMP grenade as both weapon and distraction. The device detonated with a blinding flash, temporarily disabling the nearest mutants and buying Lyra precious seconds to activate the purge sequence. The explosion sent shockwaves rippling through the chamber, knocking several of the creatures off balance. Cale seized the opportunity, darting between the towering cylinders while hurling makeshift projectiles to keep the horde at bay. Each step felt heavier than the last, exhaustion and adrenaline warring for dominance. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever, but every second counted. Behind him, alarms blared as the purge sequence initiated, sealing bulkheads and preparing the sector for decompression. Lyra worked furiously at the console, tears streaming down her face as she entered the final commands. Her hands shook, but her resolve never faltered. She owed it to the victims, to all of humanity, to ensure this nightmare ended here. With a final keystroke, the countdown began, 60 seconds until the vents opened and the air rushed out into the void. Cale fought his way back toward her, his body battered but unbroken. Together, they sprinted toward the exit, dodging grasping claws and leaping over fallen debris. The creatures pursued relentlessly, their numbers thinning but their determination unwavering. Ahead, the double doors loomed like salvation, their automatic mechanisms struggling to respond under the strain of the purge protocols. "Go," Cale yelled, shoving Lyra through the opening just as the first tendrils of vacuum breached the chamber. The rushing wind tore at his coat, threatening to pull him backward. Summoning every ounce of strength, he launched himself forward, tumbling into the safety of the corridor mere moments before the doors slammed shut behind him. The two collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath as the muffled roar of escaping air faded into silence. They were safe for now, but the cost weighed heavily on both of them. Cale stared at the sealed doors, knowing dozens of lives had been extinguished in the purge. It was a necessary evil, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. "They're gone," Lyra whispered, her voice hollow. "All those people." "And more would have followed if we hadn't stopped it," Cale replied gently, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We did what we had to do." But even as he spoke, doubt lingered in his mind. Had they truly ended the threat, or merely delayed it? The nanobots were adaptive, capable of surviving extreme conditions. Could they lie dormant, waiting for another chance to emerge? Only time would tell. For now, though, the immediate danger had passed. Word of the incident spread quickly through the station, prompting an emergency evacuation ordered by the Governing Council. Passengers and crew boarded shuttles bound for nearby colonies, their faces etched with fear and relief. Among them was Lyra, who insisted on staying until the very end to document the events for future generations. Cale, however, chose to remain behind, drawn by an inexplicable sense of duty. As the last shuttle departed, leaving Epsilon, 7 eerily silent, Cale wandered the empty corridors, his footsteps echoing like ghosts. The station was dead, or so it seemed. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something remained, watching, waiting. Perhaps it was paranoia born of exhaustion, or perhaps it was the shard still nestled in his pocket, its faint vibrations resonant with untapped potential. He reached the observation deck, gazing out at the infinite expanse of stars stretching endlessly before him. For all its beauty, space was cruel, indifferent to the struggles of those who dared to explore it. And yet, amidst the darkness, there was hope, a fragile, flickering light that refused to be extinguished. Cale smiled faintly, tucking the shard away once more. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on, armed with nothing but his wits and an unyielding desire to uncover the truth. Because that's what he did. That's who he was. If you enjoyed this interstellar mystery filled with suspense, sacrifice, and survival, don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales from the edge of the cosmos. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Until next time, remember, the universe holds countless secrets, and some are worth risking everything to uncover.